December 17th, 1944, 0530 hours. Near the village of Honsveld, Belgium, the silence was the first sign of doom. Not the respectful hush of a sleeping forest, but a dead, metallic silence. It was the sound of 700 horsepower giving up the ghost. Inside the command turret of his Tiger II tank, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, at 29 years old, one of the Third Reich's most decorated and mythologized soldiers, felt the stillness in his bones. He slammed a gloved fist against the cold steel of the turret hatch. The clang echoed unnaturally in the pre-dawn darkness, a sound of pure frustration. "Status!" he barked into the intercom. From the driver's compartment below, the voice of Unterscharführer Oberscheer came back, tight with a panic he was failing to conceal. "Nothing, Herr Obersturmbannführer. The engine, it's dead. The main tank is empty. The reserve?" Piper's voice was dangerously low. A pause, filled with the frantic sound of flipping switches. "Also dry, sir. Bone dry." Piper took a deep, steadying breath of the frigid air, thick with the smell of pine and diesel fumes. He pushed open the heavy hatch and hauled himself out. His boots crunched on the frost-covered Belgian soil, the only sound for miles. Around him, the spearhead of Operation Wogt am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, was paralyzed. This was Kampfgruppe Peiper, the most powerful armored column Germany had assembled for its last great gamble in the West. 67 of Germany's most fearsome tanks, nearly 150 half-tracks, and almost 5,000 of the Waffen-SS's most elite, battle-hardened soldiers, all rendered impotent by an enemy no amount of training or fanaticism could defeat. An empty fuel gauge, and then, through the ghostly tendrils of the pre-dawn mist, he saw it. Ahead lay the American position they had just overrun. The village of Honsveld was a critical supply depot for the US 99th Infantry Division, and the Americans had left in a hurry. A catastrophic hurry. Peiper could see fires still flickering merrily in oil drums, abandoned attempts to ward off the brutal cold. He saw metal cups of coffee on a crate, steam still faintly rising from them in the frozen air. The Americans had vanished like ghosts, leaving behind the small comforts of a war they could afford to fight with ease. But it wasn't the coffee that held Piper's gaze. It was what lay beyond it, lined up in neat, disciplined rows, stretching for hundreds of meters into the gloom, were pyramids of olive-drab jerry cans. Thousands of them. It was a temple of abundance, erected by an enemy he had been taught to view as soft, decadent, and undisciplined. His men saw it too. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the column, quickly erupting into cheers of relief and triumph. This wasn't just a supply dump. It was a miracle, a gift from the god of war himself. Peiper approached the stockpile slowly, almost reverently, like a priest approaching an altar. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruller, grabbed a can, pried open the seal with a bayonet, and took a cautious sniff. His face broke into a wide grin. "Benzin, Herr Obersturmbannführer, high-octane gasoline." The effect was instantaneous. The despair of moments before evaporated, replaced by a frantic energy. Men swarmed the stacks, passing cans hand to hand in human chains, their laughter echoing in the quiet village. They began the messy, joyous work of pouring American fuel into the thirsty gullets of German panzers. For his men, this was salvation, a sign that their luck had turned, that the offensive was blessed by fate. But as Peiper stood amidst this bounty, a different feeling began to settle over him. A realization, cold and heavy as the steel of his own tank. He was no fool. He was a veteran of the hellscape that was the Eastern Front, a place where he had learned the brutal, immutable truth of modern warfare. Fuel was blood. Ammunition could be rationed, food could be scavenged, but without fuel, the most powerful tank was just a 70-ton steel coffin. He began to walk the length of the depot, counting. The mathematics were staggering. Each can held 5 gallons. There were thousands upon thousands of them. He quickly estimated it had to be at least 50,000 gallons. Enough to refuel his entire Kampfgruppe. Enough to power their charge all the way to their primary objective. the Meuse River, enough perhaps to change the course of the entire offensive and give Germany a fighting chance. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in this one insignificant forward depot than most German divisions had received in the last 6 months combined. This should have been a moment of triumph. Yet, watching his men, the supposed Aryan supermen, the elite of the elite, so desperately siphoning the lifeblood of their enemy, Piper felt a chilling clarity descend upon him. He saw the bigger picture, the terrible truth hidden within this apparent miracle. This wasn't a gift from the god of war. It was a joke, a cruel, cosmic joke. This obscene abundance wasn't a sign of American carelessness. It was a sign of their incomprehensible power. A nation that could afford to simply leave behind what his own country would guard with an entire division was not an enemy that could be understood in conventional military terms. Germany had not just miscalculated its enemy's strength, it had fundamentally failed to comprehend the very nature of the war it was fighting. They had brought courage, tactics, and fanaticism to a fight that would be decided by factories, oil fields, and logistics spreadsheets. As the pale winter sun began to rise, casting long dark shadows from the pyramids of American fuel, Piper was forced to ask the question that would haunt the rest of his war and the rest of his life. If this is what our enemy can afford to abandon, then what hope do we have of defeating what they choose to defend? To truly understand the depth of Joachim Piper's chilling epiphany at Honsfeld, one must rewind the clock 6 months. In June of 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, stood before the Führer in the Wolf's Lair. He was a technocrat, a man of numbers and brutal logic, and he presented a report that should have ended the war on the spot. The charts and graphs told a story not of tactical defeats, but of systemic annihilation. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the very lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, was being systematically erased from the map by Allied bombers. Speer's voice was devoid of emotion as he detailed the catastrophe. The Leuna works, the crown jewel of Germany's synthetic fuel industry, which had churned out 175,000 tons of fuel in April, was projected to produce a mere 5,000 tons by September. The great hydrogenation plants at Politz, Bruchs, and Blechhammer, once symbols of Teutonic industrial might, were operating at less than 10% capacity. The numbers were not just figures on a page. They were the nails being hammered into the Third Reich's coffin. Hitler, lost in his world of fantasy maps and unwavering faith in the will of the German soldier, brushed the concerns aside. But the reality was inescapable. In 1944, the German war machine was dying of thirst. The Reich, including all its synthetic production and the captured Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, could scrape together a meager 33 million barrels of crude oil for the entire year. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different reality was unfolding. In that same year, the United States alone produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. The math is as simple as it is devastating. For every single barrel of oil available to Germany, America had more than 50. The Third Reich, the nation that had unleashed the mechanized terror of the Blitzkrieg upon the world, was now attempting to wage a modern war with the logistical capacity of a pre-industrial state. While its soldiers were still masters of tactics, they were cogs in a machine that was irrevocably running out of fuel. For the average American GI on the front lines, this German reality was not just different, it was from another universe. His world wasn't defined by scarcity, but by an overwhelming, almost casual abundance. This abundance had a name: the Red Ball Express. It wasn't just a convoy. It was a living, breathing artery of steel and rubber, stretching from the beaches of Normandy deep into the heart of France. Operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, nearly 6,000 trucks driven primarily by African-American soldiers of the Army's Transportation Corps forged a continuous, roaring river of supplies. These men, often overlooked in the grand narratives of the war, were the true engine of the Allied advance. They hauled 12,500 tons of materiel to the front every single day. They drove through rain, mud, and the constant threat of German ambush, their headlights cutting through the darkness, ensuring that the tanks of Patton and Bradley never fell silent for want of fuel or ammunition. And if the Red Ball Express was the artery, then Operation Pluto was the heart, pipeline under the ocean. The name itself was a testament to the sheer audacity of American industrial might. While German engineers were struggling to patch up bombed-out refineries, Allied engineers had laid a series of flexible 3-inch pipelines across the treacherous floor of the English Channel. By the time of the Ardennes offensive, this incredible system was pumping over 1 million gallons of fuel a day directly from Britain to the continent, a torrent of power that fed an ever-growing network of pipelines spreading across France like the roots of a great oak tree. Thousands of miles from the oil fields of his native Oklahoma, let's imagine a man like Sergeant Mackenzie "Mac" O'Connell, a quartermaster with the First Army. For Mac, the war wasn't a desperate struggle for resources. His war was a battle against paperwork and the physics of stacking things. His biggest daily problem wasn't finding fuel. It was finding a place to put all the fuel that kept arriving. He'd stand on a crate, chewing on an unlit cigar, and watch as truck after truck from the Red Ball Express rumbled into his depot, adding to the veritable mountains of jerry cans and 55-gallon drums that already surrounded him. He'd sign manifests for quantities that would have made Albert Speer weep. 8,000 gallons here, 10,000 gallons there. Sometimes he'd look at the endless stacks and shake his head, thinking about how this single muddy field in Belgium probably held more gasoline than his entire hometown had seen in a decade. For him, gasoline was like water. It was used for everything. WWII used it to clean greasy engine parts. They used it to get stubborn fires going in their makeshift stoves. They'd even, against all regulations, use a splash of it to do their laundry in a helmet. The idea of a Tiger tank, the most feared weapon on the battlefield, being stopped dead in its tracks simply because it was out of gas, was a concept so alien it was almost laughable. This was the chasm that separated the two armies fighting in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. It was a gap not of courage, or training, or even ideology, but of industrial capacity. One army, the German army, was a precision instrument, sharp and deadly, but powered by a dying battery. Its commanders were forced to make desperate gambles, betting the fate of their nation on capturing the enemy's supplies. The other army, the American army, was a sledgehammer. It was less elegant, perhaps, but it was backed by a limitless, roaring furnace of production. Its commanders didn't think in terms of scarcity. They planned their battles around the assumption of infinite supply. The tragedy for Joachim Peiper and his men was that they were the sharp tip of that precision instrument. And on that cold December morning in Honsfeld, as they joyously poured American fuel into their German tanks, they had no way of knowing that their fate had already been sealed, not on the battlefield, but in the oil fields of Texas, the factories of Detroit, and on the clipboards of men like Sergeant Mac O'Connell. The Ardennes offensive, known to the Germans as Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, was not a military strategy in the traditional sense. It was an act of sheer, nihilistic desperation. It was the final, furious roar of a dying beast. By late 1944, Hitler understood that Germany could not win a protracted war of attrition. His only remaining option was to deliver a single, shocking blow, a knockout punch, so devastating that it would force the Western Allies to the negotiating table. The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. It called for 3 German armies to smash through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and then race to seize the vital port of Antwerp. This would effectively cut the Allied forces in two, trapping the British and Canadian armies in the north. It was a phantom echo of the glorious blitzkrieg of 1940 that had conquered France in 6 weeks. But 1944 was not 1940. The German army was a shadow of its former self, bled white by years of attritional warfare on 2 fronts, and most critically, it was starved of fuel. So, a devil's bargain was struck. The entire offensive was designed around a central fatal assumption, that German spearheads like Kampfgruppe Peiper would move so fast they could capture the massive American fuel depots behind the lines before the Americans could react. The German High Command was not just launching an attack, they were launching a heist. The fuel crisis had poisoned the plan from its very conception. In the final briefing at Tondorf Castle, just 2 days before the offensive, General Sepp Dietrich, the grizzled, thuggish commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, laid out the brutal truth to Piper and his fellow officers. There were no grand speeches about patriotic duty. He was blunt, almost crude. "My boys," he said, gesturing at the map, "your fuel is over there. In the American depots, go and get it." The success of the most critical German offensive of the war was entirely dependent on looting the enemy. It was a strategy born not of strength, but of terminal weakness. This desperation cascaded down the chain of command, twisting military necessity into something far darker. Piper's orders were unequivocal. Speed was everything. He was the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point, the tip of the spear. He was to bypass strong points, avoid prolonged engagements, and drive relentlessly for the Meuse. And he was not to be burdened. No time for prisoners was the implicit, and sometimes explicit, command. Taking prisoners required guards, it required transport, it required food, and all of that required fuel. In the cold, hard calculus of the Ardennes offensive, the life of an American prisoner of war was worth less than the gasoline needed to transport him to the rear. This is the grim context needed to understand what happened on December 17th, just hours after the miraculous discovery at Honsfeld. Near a crossroads outside the town of Malmedy, Piper's column encountered and quickly overwhelmed a convoy from the American 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Over 100 American soldiers were taken prisoner. For a commander on a normal battlefield, this would be a routine matter. But Piper was not on a normal battlefield. He was a man racing against a ticking clock, his tanks now running on borrowed time and captured fuel. The American prisoners were a liability, an anchor threatening to slow his vital momentum. What happened next remains one of the most infamous war crimes committed by German troops on the Western Front. The unarmed American prisoners were herded into a frozen field. Machine guns opened up. At least 84 men were murdered in cold blood. Was this massacre the result of a direct order from Piper? He would deny it for the rest of his life. Was it the spontaneous brutality of his SS troopers, men indoctrinated in the merciless ideology of the Eastern Front? Or was it something more insidious? Was it the inevitable, rotten fruit of a military plan that had dehumanized the enemy to the point where their lives were weighed against gallons of gasoline and found wanting? This question forces us to confront a deeply unsettling aspect of warfare. Does extreme logistical desperation create monsters, or does it merely give existing monsters permission to act? The Malmedy massacre was not just an atrocity, it was a symptom of the moral bankruptcy at the heart of the entire operation. When a plan hinges on the desperate hope of stealing from your enemy just to keep moving, the line between soldier and marauder begins to blur. The rules of war, fragile at the best of times, simply dissolve. Piper's men were told they were the elite, the embodiment of martial virtue. Yet their orders reduced them to the level of highwaymen, their primary objective not the defeat of an enemy army, but the capture of its gas stations. This moral corrosion, this devil's bargain, had consequences far beyond the battlefield. It set the stage for a level of brutality on the Western Front that had, until that point, been rare. As the refueled panzers of Kampfgruppe Piper roared away from Honsfeld, they were not just driving towards the Meuse River. They were driving headlong into a moral abyss, one created by the desperation of a regime that was willing to sacrifice not only its soldiers, but its last vestiges of honor for a few more gallons of fuel. The tragedy of Malmedy is inextricably linked to the miracle at Honsfeld. The captured gasoline provided the means to advance, but the desperate need for it provided the justification for murder. Reborn. That was the only word for it. Fueled by the enemy's own lifeblood, Kampfgruppe Piper was a phoenix rising from the ashes of its own logistical failure. The growl of nearly 70 Maybach engines once again shattered the winter silence. The column surged forward with renewed purpose, a steel serpent slithering through the winding roads of the Ardennes. They stormed through the Belgian town of Bühlingen, capturing more American supplies, rations, ammunition, and most critically, maps showing the locations of other, larger fuel depots in the area. Hope, for the first time in months, felt real. Piper, now running on American fuel and guided by American maps, was a phantom deep behind enemy lines. He was the embodiment of the German martial ideal, swift, ruthless, and terrifyingly effective. His spearhead pushed on relentlessly, a dagger aimed at the heart of the Allied war effort. By the evening of December 17th, his forward elements were approaching the town of Stavelot, and it was here, near Stavelot, that Piper believed he had found the key to victory. His captured maps indicated the presence of a massive American fuel depot, one that dwarfed the miraculous find at Honsfeld. It was said to contain over 2 million gallons of gasoline. 2 million gallons. The number was almost beyond comprehension. It wasn't just enough to get his Kampfgruppe to the Meuse River and beyond to Antwerp. It was enough fuel to breathe life back into the entire 6th SS Panzer Army. It was enough to potentially turn the tide of the war. This wasn't a supply dump. It was the Holy Grail. The promise of this single objective justified every risk, every gamble, every crime committed along the way. But the Americans, though caught by surprise, were not idle. As Piper's tanks closed in on Stavelot, a desperate race against time was already underway. The defenders of the depot were not frontline infantrymen or hardened tankers. They were engineers. Men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, led by a captain named John Brewster. Their job was usually to build bridges, clear mines, and construct roads. But on this day, their mission was deconstruction, annihilation. Captain Brewster had received the warning. A powerful German armoured column was approaching fast. His orders were brutally simple. Deny the fuel to the enemy, at any cost. He stood before a breathtaking sight. A sprawling 15-acre field covered in pyramids of jerry cans, 2,189,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline. It was a monument to American industrial power, and his job was to tear it down in the most spectacular way imaginable. There was no time for subtlety. Brewster's men worked with frantic haste, their breath misting in the cold air. They poured trails of gasoline between the massive stacks, creating fuses. They distributed white phosphorus grenades, wicked incendiary devices that burned with an unholy heat. At 4:30 p.m., as the clatter of Piper's lead tanks echoed from the hills, Captain Brewster gave the order. Technical Sergeant Paul Soles pulled the pin on the first grenade and lobbed it into a gasoline-soaked stack. The result was not an explosion. It was an apocalypse. A wall of fire erupted towards the heavens, a roiling liquid pillar of orange and black that instantly vaporized everything it touched. A deafening roar swallowed all other sounds. Within minutes, the entire 15-acre depot was an inferno. The heat was so intense it buckled steel and melted glass over a mile away. A colossal pillar of black smoke climbed thousands of feet into the sky, a funeral pyre visible for 100 miles, a dark exclamation point marking the death of Germany's last hope. When Joachim Paper's lead tanks crested the final ridge overlooking Stavelot, this was the sight that greeted them. Not the Holy Grail, but a vision of hell. He stood on the turret of his Tiger, silhouetted against the raging inferno, and simply watched. The fire would burn for 3 days. His driver, Unterscharführer Oberscheer, later described the moment. The Obersturmbannführer stood on his tank turret, watching the flames. He said nothing for perhaps 5 minutes. He just stared. Then he climbed down, his face like stone, and told me, "Oberscheer, they can afford to burn 2 million gallons, just to keep it from us. What are we doing here?" That question hung in the air, more chilling than the Ardennes winter. In that instant, the war ceased to be about tactics, courage, or the superiority of the German soldier. Piper, the warrior prince of the Waffen-SS, the man who believed in shock and awe, was now confronted with an enemy whose greatest weapon wasn't a tank or a plane, but the casual ability to destroy on a scale that beggared belief. This was the moment the romantic notion of warfare died for him. The idea that a heroic warrior, a modern-day Teutonic knight, could triumph through sheer will and martial prowess was exposed as a childish fantasy. How could a knight's sword compete with a furnace? How could courage stand against an enemy who could burn an ocean of the very resource his own army was dying for? Across the Ardennes, the same scene was playing out. At Spa, American engineers torched 2.5 million gallons. At Francorchamps, another 500,000 went up in smoke. In total, during that first critical week, the U.S. Army deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons of their own fuel rather than risk it falling into German hands. They burned more fuel than Hitler had managed to allocate for the entire offensive. For Peiper, standing before the pillar of fire at Stavelot, the discovery at Honsfeld was cast in a new, horrifying light. The 50,000 gallons that had seemed like a miracle that morning were revealed for what they truly were: a rounding error, a pittance, the loose change that had fallen from the pocket of a giant. The war had been decided not by generals, but by the cold, hard mathematics of production. And in that moment, watching his grand prize go up in smoke, Joachim Peiper finally understood that he and his entire nation were on the wrong side of the equation. The pillar of fire at Stavelot was a funeral pyre, and what died in its flames was the German offensive. For Joachim Peiper, the war of movement was over. The hunter had become the hunted. His panzers, now running on fumes, were cornered in the frozen valley of l'Église. The American rings of steel and fire tightened around him with each passing hour. By December 23rd, the situation was hopeless. Peiper had perhaps 1,000 gallons of fuel left, enough for a few hours of localized combat, but not enough for a breakout. His mighty Tiger II tanks, 70-ton behemoths that had terrorized Allied tankers, sat silent and helpless, transformed from apex predators into steel mausoleums. That night, under the cover of a blizzard, Peiper gave the order that must have felt like a dagger to his own heart: abandon the vehicles. His men, the elite of the SS, were forced to commit the ultimate sacrilege. They placed explosive charges inside their own perfect, undamaged machines. One by one, the pride of the German armaments industry, the Tigers, the Panthers, the King Tigers, were turned into burning hulks by their own crews. Oberreiter Heinz Goals described the scene with bitterness years later. We drained the last drops of fuel from all the vehicles, maybe 200 gallons in total. The Obersturmbannführer personally destroyed his own command tank, millions of Reichsmarks of equipment gone, defeated not by enemy shells, but by empty fuel tanks. Of the nearly 5,000 men who had started the offensive with Kampfgruppe Peiper, only around 800 would make it back through the American lines on foot. They were no longer the arrogant supermen of Nazi propaganda. They were starving, frost-bitten spectres, stumbling through the snow, haunted by the ghosts of their abandoned machines and the dawning, soul-crushing realization of their nation's predicament. And as they struggled, they began to encounter the true nature of their enemy. It wasn't in the firepower of the Shermans or the ferocity of the 82nd Airborne. It was in the trash. Captured German soldiers would later speak of their shock, not with fear, but with a kind of bewildered awe. They saw American GIS casually discard half-eaten chocolate bars, a luxury most German soldiers hadn't seen in years. They found entire crates of rations pushed into ditches, deemed not fresh enough. They saw Americans using precious gasoline to clean their boots or to get a stubborn campfire going for warmth. One German colonel, Friedrich August von der Heyte, a famed paratroop commander also trapped in the Ardennes, was captured on Christmas Eve. During interrogation, he told his American captors, "Your soldiers, they do not know the meaning of the word shortage. They throw away what my men would consider a feast. You cannot fight an enemy that can afford such waste. It is not a war, it is a force of nature." This sentiment spread like a virus through the German ranks. Every soldier who witnessed this casual abundance understood. The war was hopeless. While Peiper's men were freezing on foot, a starkly different drama was unfolding to the south. General George S. Patton's Third Army, which had been preparing for an offensive into the German Saarland, received an order that German commanders considered impossible. He was to disengage, pivot his entire army 90 degrees to the north, and drive over 100 miles through ice and snow to relieve the besieged American forces in Bastogne. This was a maneuver that should have taken weeks of planning. The German High Command, who measured every major movement in agonizing calculations of fuel availability, simply could not conceive of it being done in days. But they weren't accounting for the American way of war. Patton's Third Army did not move like an army. It moved like a leviathan of steel and gasoline awakening from its slumber. An unstoppable flood of 133,000 vehicles began to roll, day and night. The logistics were staggering. The redeployment alone required 350,000 gallons of gasoline per day. It was a river of fuel, flowing without end, powering a miracle of modern logistics. In just 3 days, Patton's lead elements were crashing into the southern flank of the German offensive, completely shattering the enemy's operational timetable. The sheer scale of this American abundance is perfectly captured in a single, almost comical anecdote from the logbooks of the U.S. First Army. On December 27th, a senior logistics officer filed a complaint. He noted with concern that the recent stretch of bad weather had grounded many of the supply planes and slowed the Red Ball Express. As a result, fuel deliveries for that day had been reduced to a disappointing mere 500,000 gallons. Let that sink in. An American officer was complaining about a single day's fuel delivery that was still 10 times the amount Piper had miraculously captured at Honsfeld, and was more than the entire German 6th SS Panzer Army had been allocated for the first phase of the most important offensive of their year. What was a logistical crisis for one side was not even a rounding error for the other. This was the unwinnable war. It wasn't about the quality of the soldier or the brilliance of the commander. It was a war of systems, of industrial bases, of oil wells and refineries. The German soldier was fighting for the liter. The American GI was supported by the million-gallon pipeline. As the remnants of Kampfgruppe Paper finally staggered back to their own lines, they were changed men. They had gone into the Ardennes believing they were the spearhead of a decisive victory. They came back as messengers of an undeniable truth. Germany wasn't just losing a war, it was being systematically and effortlessly overwhelmed by an enemy whose power operated on a scale they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The story of Joachim Piper and the 50,000 gallons of fuel at Honsfeld is more than just a war story. It is a parable for the entire industrial age of warfare. It marks the precise moment when the romantic ideal of the warrior was rendered obsolete by the brutal, impersonal mathematics of production. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't won in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. It was won years earlier in the boardrooms of Standard Oil, in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, and on the assembly lines of Detroit. The final statistics of the conflict tell the whole story. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly 50% of the world's manufactured goods. A new bomber rolled off an assembly line every 5 minutes. A new merchant ship was launched every single day. And the petroleum numbers were the most damning of all. The Axis powers combined Germany, Japan, and Italy produced less than 2% of the crude oil that flowed from American wells. The war wasn't a fair fight, it was an industrial execution. This truth, which Piper discovered in a flash of terrible clarity at Stavelot, was later confirmed by the very architects of the German war machine. At the Nuremberg trials, when asked what had been the decisive factor in Germany's defeat, the highest-ranking Nazi officials gave answers that were strikingly consistent. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the Wehrmacht High Command, testified, "We had operational superiority in 1940 and 41, but by 1944, we could not move a single division for lack of fuel, while the Americans moved entire armies around the map like they were chess pieces." Albert Speer, the armaments minister who had tried to warn Hitler, was even more blunt. "The American soldier was not better than our own," he stated. But he was supported by a weight of material that is unparalleled in the history of warfare. A tank commander who runs out of fuel is no longer a tank commander. Even Joachim Piper himself, tried for the war crimes committed at Malmedy, offered a revealing perspective from the witness stand. "Every decision I made after December 17th, he said, his voice cold, was dictated by the fuel gauge. We could not maneuver, we could not pursue, we could not even retreat effectively. The Americans moved with a freedom we could not imagine, while we were forced to count every liter." His life after the war was a grim postscript to his legend. Sentenced to death for the Malmedy massacre, his sentence was later commuted. He was released in 1956 and lived in relative obscurity, eventually settling in a small town in France. but his past would not leave him. On Bastille Day, July 14th, 1976, his house was firebombed by unknown assailants, believed to be former members of the French resistance. The once feared panzer commander, the man who had stared into the inferno at Stavelot, died in a fire of his own. His story, and the story of the Ardennes offensive, serves as a permanent, chilling lesson. In modern industrialized warfare, logistics is not just a part of the strategy. Logistics is the strategy. Production overwhelms courage. Abundance defeats dedication. The German soldier of 1944 was arguably the best trained, most combat-experienced infantryman in the world. It did not matter. He was a warrior in an age of mechanics, a hero in a world run by accountants. Today, in the museum at L'Église, Belgium, sits one of Joachim Paper's King Tiger tanks. It is the same one he abandoned on that desperate night in December 1944. It is a magnificent, terrifying machine, a monument to tactical excellence, and its fuel gauge still points to empty. It stands as a silent testament to the moment when the most advanced weaponry in the world was defeated by the simplest of problems. The story of Piper's discovery forces us to look beyond the battlefield and into the factories and the oil fields that truly decide the fate of nations. It strips away the myths of martial glory and reveals a harder truth, that the blood of soldiers is meaningless without the oil that fuels the machines of war. And this brings us to the lingering, difficult question that hangs over this entire episode of history. The discovery at Honsfeld and the inferno at Stavelot revealed an undeniable truth about the industrial might that wins modern wars. But what about the events at Malmedy? Does the brutal, dehumanizing pressure of logistical desperation, the knowledge that your entire mission hangs on a few cans of gasoline, in any way excuse or explain the murder of 84 unarmed men? Or does it simply provide the context in which the darkest aspects of human nature and of a murderous ideology are allowed to run free? Ultimately, who were the true victors of the Battle of the Bulge? Was it the brave American G.I., who held the line at Bastogne and fought in the frozen forests? Or was it the anonymous roughnecks on the oil derricks in Texas, the union workers on the assembly lines in Michigan, the unsung truck drivers of the Red Ball Express? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you want to explore more of the untold stories that reveal the true nature of World War II, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. Thank you for watching.